Now, it is the case that engineers today are trained in schools, and in fact, they are now trained in universities. Although up until approximately 10 years ago, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the schools in which engineers were trained were predominantly called polytechnics. The rise of academic institutions in engineering in Great Britain illustrates again the dominance of the apprenticeship system, or what might also be described as the shop culture. There were advocates in the British context for academically trained engineers, but there was resistance from all sides for a long period of time. The apprenticeship culture resisted classroom training for engineers. Picture yourself a senior engineer who has come up through that apprenticeship system, through years of practical work on the job. And imagine yourself in your office, and the young advocate for school culture engineers comes into your office and says, look, we could train engineers in schools. I mean, to you this sounds ludicrous. How can you train, how could engineers gain this practical craft knowledge sitting in the classroom, reading books, for crying out loud? So, the engineers themselves, especially civil engineers, constituted a major source of resistance to any kind of school training. In addition, there's direct competition with science and scientists for access to higher education. Science had achieved success for its claim that it provided ultimate sources of knowledge. And scientists and the professionalization of science included finding its way into elite institutions, which in the United States are basically understood in the United States as basically Oxford and Cambridge. The elite institutions, which had been training gentlemen in professions or landed gentry for long periods of time, wanted no parts of these new practical people, these people who would get their hands dirty, these people who emphasize craftsmanship. Well, wait a minute, artisans were interested in craftsmanship, and artisans wouldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. Engineers, despite their claims to be professionals and to be gentlemen, certainly shouldn't be permitted at Oxford and Cambridge. So what happened is that a new kind of educational institution developed, the so-called polytechnics. Some of you are enrolled at a school called Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. The idea of the Polytechnic as a school, as a technical school with many dimensions, many disciplines, is a European invention. And the Polytechnic Institutes developed, not surprisingly, in the big industrial cities of Great Britain, the centers of the Industrial Revolution, in Scotland and the Midlands of England. You'll find major polytechnics in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, and in Manchester. A total of 60 different institutions. And the education in this even though engineering education was finding its way into formalized environments and into formalized educational institutions, the emphasis remained on practical training. As Maurice puts it, quote, "The pattern of English pre-university studies, particularly in the period since World War I, has been to develop a high degree of specialization at secondary school by concentration on a few subjects. This has arisen to enable the established 3-year degree course to cover the necessary technical material, with the unfortunate result that students from age 16 to 18 are actually prepared only in the 3 subjects of mathematics, physics, and chemistry." What's behind this account is that students aiming towards engineering prepare themselves in these basic sciences, math, physics, and chemistry, and then go off into 3-year courses of study. 3-year courses of study with a lot of shop work, a lot of practical training to get them off, and then off into industry. Note then that the engineers trained in this tradition through the 19th century and in through the 20th century have relatively minimal relationships with government. They worked for government on large government projects for which they were commissioned. A commission engineer was a project engineer who worked for the length of the project. They became experts in government matters, for example, bridge failures or railroad failures, and so they were hired in to testify. However, they relatively rarely worked directly inside of government enterprises in Great Britain itself. In sharp contrast, however, the British engineers who traveled to the colonies, remember, the British dominated the world in the 19th century. It was argued that the sun never sets on the British Empire. The engineers who traveled to other colonies found themselves actively linked to colonial governments, and so when they were living and working in the colonies, they might be directly connected with the government, but not in the British context itself. R.A. Buchanan, who is probably certainly the leading historian of engineering in Great Britain, points out that the total number of engineers in Great Britain increased from 1,000 in 1850 to over 40,000 in 1914, or right around World War I. It was widespread practice, he points out, for many of these men to serve abroad for at least part of their careers. And so the process of producing new engineers in schools, in polytechnics, also led to an increase in their participation in colonial governments and colonial activities. Let us jump ahead to today. We've talked in this class about the rise of competitiveness and America's reaction to a perceived threat from Japan and Asian countries. The British and the Europeans in general also felt a similar sort of challenge. Indeed, their challenge was deemed to be a greater one because they also had to compete with the United States as a separated set of small countries. This concern about international and global competitiveness has fueled a drive to unification, collaboration, and unification by lowering barriers in trade between countries, by developing a common currency, and in our context, by trying to figure out ways of bringing together engineers. The practical trained engineers are having difficulties interacting with the French and the German traditions, which we will be exploring. The engineers are attempting to work together to certify a unique kind of engineer called the European ingénieur, or the European engineer in the French term, with the French term. But the demands of practical education, or the celebration of practical education, contrast sharply with the celebration of theoretical education, and particularly in France, but also in Germany. So the British find themselves with a problem. The British engineers find themselves with a problem. They have celebrated practical education for a long period of time, and the senior engineers continue to emphasize or celebrate the British craftsmanship. And yet, in a context, and in a global context, in which engineering in countries such as the United States and France has been dramatically different. How can the British hang on to their tradition while at the same time interacting in a more thoroughgoing way with their collaborators and their neighbors? This is the problem of the British. Again, to the extent that you see in yourselves an interest in practical knowledge, to the extent you see it in your own activities, an emphasis on practical materials, you find yourself to be, and should consider yourself to be, at least in part, British.